In the pre-dawn hush of June 6, 1944, the English Channel became a ribbon of steel and shadow. More than 156,000 Allied troops would surge across 5 beaches. Yet this invasion was not only made of generals' plans and ships' hulls. It was made of human bodies, young and old, trained and terrified. This is the story of one small boy, Paul, 11 years old, whose life was folded into the tidal sweep of history. He came from a world of ration cards, whispered suspicion, and curfews. Stepping out of line could mean arrest or death. When Paul stumbled into an American parachute regiment on the eve of the invasion, helplessness hardened into defiance. What follows blends archival truth with the intimate, bone-deep cadence of survival. A mission that would drag him into the chaos of D-Day and force him to reckon with courage.
Paul's world narrowed to a ration ticket and the shape of his father's shadow on the kitchen wall. By late May 1944, English towns had learned to live under the drumbeat of war. Blackout curtains, neighbors who watched each other as closely as they watched the passing convoys. Paul had turned 11 with a silence the family called maturity. His mother stitched extra patches into his clothes and spoke in softer tones to keep fear from the rooms. He had never seen a soldier up close before, only the occasional sentry, brisk and stern, until a late afternoon when an American detachment billeted in the old schoolhouse arrived, a ragged promise of something different. The men moved with a rehearsed gentleness when they noticed the boy, offering him a chocolate bar and the casual kindness of strangers who had learned to keep humanity despite orders. Paul, who had learned how small acts acted like anchors in stormy seas, watched their maps and the folded parachutes with a greedy, secret hunger. The soldiers joked about letters from home and the smell of coffee, but the maps drew a different kind of attention. Names of Normandy farms, coded beaches, and chalked windows with penciled times. One corporal, young, freckled, with a cigarette stub tucked from habit, noticed Paul's fixation and slid a crumpled photograph across the table. Men leaping into night sky, canopies blooming like ghost flowers. The photo glinted with hope and danger, and Paul found his thumb tracing one tiny face in the image. "You like planes?" the man asked. Paul lied and said he did. That lie, small as it was, set the cogs of events turning. The corporal would later call him Kid, and the name would cling like a talisman when louder things happened. In the days that followed, suspicion thickened. Neighbors listening for whispered German, men shadowed in alleys, and a curfew that felt more like a noose. Yet Paul learned the soldier's rhythm. Wash, mend, check boots, fold parachutes in a quiet cadence, whisper orders like prayers. When a mission brief arrived the night before the regiment was due to move out, a small sabotage task on an enemy radio relay rumored to blunt coastal communications, the corporal grinned at the men and then looked at Paul as if assessing whether a key might be hidden in plain sight. The boy's heart tripped. Helped by one small kindness, Paul was asked to carry a package, a sealed tin of spare parts, across a lane to a hideout near the ruined mill. It was not an extraordinary task for soldiers, but for a child in wartime it felt like stepping over an invisible line. He said nothing, because to speak was to become visible. He tucked the tin beneath his jacket, feeling the cold snap of metal against his ribs, and walked into a night scored by searchlights and distant artillery.
The week between late May and June turned into a lesson in watchfulness. Orders circulated in whisper. H-Day was close. Radio silence. Nothing to be said to civilians. The American regiment rehearsed in fields until dawn, men leaping from trucks and setting drills like a relentless metronome. Night brought maps and cigarettes. Daylight brought the clatter of preparations. Paul now moved within this nervous orbit. His errands, which had begun as small, useful tasks, became threads of a larger weave. He learned to fold parachute cords into tidy coils and to set small tracer charges for demolition men to test. He learned to carry messages through hedgerows where German patrols could have been hiding behind any tuft of grass. On June 2, the regiment received a fresh briefing. Teams would be dropped inland ahead of the main landings to seize bridges, confuse communications, and kill time for the German defenders. There was an urgency in the briefing that made men look older, as if listening to it added years. The corporal who had given Paul the photograph cupped his hands and said, "Kid, this will be a rough one. Keep your head low and don't make trouble." Yet the mission needed hands, and the quick pair, like Paul's, could slip into places adult eyes might mark as ordinary. That evening, Paul was given instructions to escort a wounded messenger across a narrow lane where a wire fence had been fished open and a blindfold of dark hedgerows offered cover. The messenger's face was a map of exhaustion and fear. He clung to the boy's arm as if to a rope thrown to shore. Together, they crept past the ruined mill where the tin Paul had once carried now sat hidden in straw. Every step was measured against the distant roar of artillery practice, each shadow potentially a German scout. Paul felt the weight of the tin inside his jacket, the weight of responsibility in a belly hollowed by fear and something else, a new, fierce belonging. For the first time, he heard words that would come back to him for the rest of his life. "We don't leave a man behind." The phrase folded into his thoughts like a blade into cloth, sharp and quietly irreversible.
The regiment's hum was now a living thing, a constant low vibration that lived in boots, tents, and bones. By June 4, the invasion fleet lay like a sleeping beast beyond the headland. Radios whispered final codes, and men checked each other's gear with the tenderness of people about to risk everything together. Paul had been given more than errands. The corporal trusted him to watch the regimental notice board and deliver a sealed note to the sergeant in the motor pool. For a child, the notice board looked like a cathedral of plans, typed lists, crude sketches of hedgerows, names of farms, and drop coordinates. He learned the language of command quickly, abbreviations that sounded like spells, OBJ, cut comms, 0-hour contingency. That night, as the men folded parachutes under lanterns and patched gumboots with practiced hands, a lieutenant spoke in low tones about the mission's aim: to cut the enemy's ability to call reinforcements, to make silence where once there was barked command. Paul pocketed the folded note and walked past trucks piled with supplies, past a radio set whose dials seemed as complex as a cathedral organ. Outside, planes drifted like sleeping birds, loaded with men who would be dropped into fields they had never seen. The child felt both weight and smallness in the same breath, the weight of being entrusted, the smallness of being so little in a sky so wide. He slept with the tin beneath his pillow, listening to the distant roll of engines like thunder that was trying, politely, not to wake the world. The sky that held the invasion the next morning was not simply weather. It was a decision that governments and generals argued over until gentlemen's voices turned to terse commands.
On June 5, the camp vibrated with a brittle eagerness. Men sharpened helmets like utensils, and the air smelled of tar, coffee, and tightened nerves. Paul was told to stay near the motor pool, but the idea of staying still was impossible for a child whose life had begun to orbit soldiers. The corporal, a man whose humor had thinned to a fine wire, handed Paul a folded strip of paper, a list of crossroads, a sketch of a farmhouse, a single circled name. "If anyone asks, you're delivering bread," he said, voice low. Paul learned that secrecy came dressed as ordinary errands. The regiment practiced silent movements, motors idling in the dark, paratroopers checking leg straps and making small knots in their scarves to remind themselves whose name to say if they died. Rumors slid through the company: postponement, go, hold, and between each rumor, men wrote letters they slid into tins and helmets. Paul tucked the map into his pocket and sat beneath a lorry while men rehearsed. The world felt pressed thin as paper. He watched a lieutenant pat a sergeant's shoulder, and without the pomp of speeches, understood that these people had chosen to make courage their work. The night deepened into a hush, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. June 6th arrived in slices of noise. The drone of engines, the snap of canvas, the metallic clack of boots. The regiment loaded into aircraft thick with men, and the air smelled of oil and fear. Paul rode at the edge of the world, a small body inside a larger machine. The tin of mechanical parts pressed against his chest like a secret compass. When the jump lights blinked and the doors swung open, the night outside was a black mouth of sky and stars blurred by forward motion. Men slid into darkness, and for a breathless space there was a sublime, vertiginous silence. Then a violent, glorious falling that pinched Paul's breath. Landing was less like the stories, and more like being thrown into a pageant of pain and will. The hedgelines became jagged mouths, wires like teeth, and the earth itself offered an uneven welcome. Gunfire stitched the fields, flares sketched ghostly halos and then vanished. Paul moved with the small, precise motions taught to him by patient hands. Keep low, pass the tin to a man in green, drag a fallen comrade into cover. He watched a corporal he loved stumble, saw the flash of a wound, and felt a fierce animal decision to pull him behind a bank. The mission, cut communications, hold crossroads, was lived in small, urgent measures. Rip down a line, jam a switch, shout a warning. By dawn, the hedgerow bore its new map of bodies, footprints, and blood. Paul understood that bravery left marks not in medals, but on hands that would tremble in years to come. The morning after D-Day felt like the world had been unstitched and then roughly re-sewn. June 7 began with a brittle light and an ache that was both physical and moral. Fields littered with uniforms, radios smashed, and the constant work of counting those who remained. Paul walked through a landscape still steaming from explosions and the smell of spent powder. Men moved with a new gravity, as if the day before had taken from them a part of their old selves. The regiment's objective broadened into prying open supply routes and holding key junctions against counterattacks. Paul discovered what "we don't leave a man behind" meant in practice. Pairs of hands reaching across mud to haul a groaning body, men digging shallow graves with trembling tools. The tin he had carried, the small thing that had felt like destiny, had done its work. A nearby radio console jammed, and for a little while the German lines hiccuped with confusion. But the cost was heavy. Friends were missing. The corporal who had trusted him sat silent, bandages darkened at his sleeve. Paul learned then that missions could be both necessary and merciless, that victory sometimes required the world to be empty in places where life had been. He held the small tin and felt it grow lighter in his hands and heavier in his conscience. The boy who had once feared the tilt of a shadow now walked with a set jaw. The battlefield had carved something into him that would not be eased by time or medals. By June 10th, the regiment had learned to move with exhaustion braided into its muscles. The beaches were behind them, but not forgotten. Every ridge and cow track seemed to remember the night's violence. Supplies creaked into place, but the map of Normandy shifted daily beneath bootprints and blood. Paul now walked the world with a soldier's punctuality. Check the perimeter, bring water, count rations. He had been given a task that felt like trust, helping to guide a small patrol across a shell-scarred lane to a ruined farmhouse where resistance guerrillas were believed to hide supplies. The farmhouse was a skeleton of roof beams and soot, curtains ragged like old flags. Inside, the patrol found a radio set half smashed and a ledger of names. The ledger made Paul's stomach tighten. Lists of people, villages, dates, the cold architecture of occupation. The corporal sat him down and said simply, "We're making a place where people can live again. You see this? Remember it." That night, Paul watched an old woman in a neighboring farm give bread to a soldier with a nod that held more thanks than language. The moment taught him something of the war's strange arithmetic. In saving strangers, you sometimes saved a piece of yourself. He slept with the sense that the land, too, was healing, though not yet whole, and that small, steady acts of care mattered as much as tactics. A week into inland operations, the regiment lived between letters and loss. Men wrote home in cramped script, folding hopes into envelopes that smelled faintly of tobacco and engine oil. Paul began to copy names into the ledger retrieved from the farmhouse, learning the contours of each syllable as if pronouncing them might make them safer. That day, a stretcher came across the ridge carrying a man with no visible sign except the slack of his hands and the blank set of his face. The corporal, who had become Paul's guardian, cradled the man's memories in silence, then sat with Paul and opened a letter from his own wife. He read few lines aloud. The rest he let sit between them like a raw thing too stern to be gentled by words. Paul, who had once thought bravery was loud, discovered it was quiet and patient. The act of folding a letter, of making tea for a man who could no longer drink, of counting names each night so no one was anonymous to those left behind. That evening the choir of the camp was muffled. The men prayed, cursed softly, or stared into the dark. Paul watched the corporal trace the name of a fallen comrade onto a scrap and then tuck it into his pocket. The boy felt a grief that was both personal and communal, the recognition that the war would keep exacting its price in names. By June 22, the Germans, stunned by the landings, attempted local counterattacks. The regiment readied itself for sharp, sudden strikes. Men dug shallow foxholes, barbed wire was hastily strung, and officers marked fallback positions on mud-slicked maps. Word reached them that a column of enemy troops was pushing through a valley to retake a hamlet crucial for supply lines. Paul rode with a support squad, the vehicle rattling like a coffin lid over stones. When the first shells fell, the world tore open in sound and smell. The squad dismounted and rushed to form a line. Paul moved with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed fear into a function. Hand rations to the wounded, fetch bandages, hold a torch for a surgeon. The battle was close and bloody, artillery spitting like a furious beast. In the smoke, Paul saw the corporal fall, a crimson bloom startling in the gray. He ran, not with the wildness of panic, but with the methodical care of a child taught to tie knots and lighten burdens. He dragged the man behind a hedge, supporting his weight while a medic worked with steady hands. The day ended with the counterattack repelled and a ledger that had gained new names. Paul understood then that heroism had faces and addresses. It could be counted and mourned and then remembered. By July 1, the front had become a necklace of broken roads and makeshift bridges. The regiment's days measured in the delivery of fuel, food, and bullets. The work of war showed itself in logistics. A flat tire at the wrong moment could turn a plan into a catastrophe. Paul found meaning in those small mercies, a kettle drum of hot stew ladled to frost-numbed men, a parcel of cigarettes split like rare currency. He was assigned to the quartermaster's tent for a time, where piles of blankets smelled faintly of lavender from a previous steward's habit. Here he learned another side of service: inventory, patience, the quiet arithmetic of survival. An old corporal from the motor pool taught him to patch canvas, to balance a list of names against a dwindling stock of tins. One afternoon, a child from a nearby hamlet came through the wire, eyes wide, clutching a bundle of stamped postcards, asking if the Americans would pass on messages to families. Paul sat and wrote with a borrowed pencil. The act of writing tethered him to the world beyond mud and orders. That night, the boy folded the postcards into a creased envelope and slid them into the quartermaster's satchel, feeling that even in war there were still small human transactions that kept hope circulating. On July 12th, the regiment moved to secure a bridge that intelligence said was lightly held. The approach was a crooked lane flanked by poplars, the kind of place that looks calm until it isn't. Paul rode with a reconnaissance team and felt the prickle that meant danger was near. They were ambushed, the first volley tearing at the air, and the second turning the lane into a thunderclap. The squad scrambled for cover. Men shouted names, and the words "grenade" and "hold" pierced the smoke. Paul found himself pressed under a lorry, breathing the diesel and the fear of being too small to matter. A blazing tracer cut a path mere inches away, and the corporal, the same man who had once folded parachutes with him, pushed a body over Paul's involuntary breath, shielding him with the heavy curve of shoulder and helmet. The corporal's face was calm in the moment of bearing agony. He spat blood and muttered, "You're coming with me, kid." Paul emerged covered in dust and with a new intimate knowledge of the way survival sometimes wore the shape of someone else's sacrifice. The ruined farmhouse returned as a waypoint of memory. On July 20, the patrol returned to search for hidden supplies and the family who may have once lived there. The rooms smelled of damp straw and old smoke. Paul moved through the house with reverence, fingers brushing a child's etched alphabet on a windowsill and a faded photograph propped against a hearthstone. The photograph showed a family smiling in front of a bike, the edges curled like river stones. Paul thought of his own family's hands. He pressed the photo to his chest as if it were a talisman. In the loft, they found a cache of letters wrapped in oilcloth, a personal archive of lives interrupted. The letters told of ordinary things, a son's apprenticeship, a market dispute, a birth announcement. Each line turned the abstract cost of war into brittle, specific loss. The corporal sat with Paul and read a passage aloud, then folded the letters and left them to be catalogued for return if possible. That afternoon, Paul began to understand the moral geography of war. Beyond military maps lived the maps of people's days, and these were worth keeping intact when possible.
In early August, fragments of larger strategy dripped down to the front. Radio broadcasts spoke of Allied advances on broader fronts, and whispers of German retreat grew louder. Men allowed themselves brief smiles that felt half-earned. The regiment's role shifted from purely holding ground to preparing for renewed pushes. Mail arrived in trickles, and a newspaper, sodden but legible, made its way through the camp. Paul read aloud in a circle of tired faces. The headlines spoke of progress and of cities pushing back the shadow of occupation. Yet celebration was tempered by a ledger of costs. The names on the regiment's list had grown, and the corporal who had taught him still walked with a limp and a silence that would not yield to cheer. The boy felt an odd split, elation for global gains, and an ache that they arrived at a price measured in the hush at the mess table. That evening, a church bell in a captured village pealed twice, a tentative sound that made the men look up, as if they could drink hope directly from the bell's tone. By mid-August, rumors of liberation swept Normandy like a fever. On August 15, Allied forces made decisive moves. Towns along the coast saw soldiers hoist flags and civilians step into streets with faces that had been held tight for years. The regiment was assigned to push toward a market town where reports suggested retreating enemy units had left civilians stranded. Paul walked into a square where laundry hung in the sun as if proof against loss, and an old man pressed a loaf into a soldier's hands with tears and a single, steady word: "Merci." The boy learned the shape of gratitude in that moment, raw, immediate, and not always clean. But the day also forced a reckoning. The ledger showed missing names and a list of villages scorched in rearguard actions. Paul, who had once measured courage by motion, now saw it as a ledger entry. A town saved, a family saved, a name listed. The complexity of liberation sunk in, victory woven with ruin, and the regiment moved on, carrying both flags and funerary rites. September carried a hard air. Borders that had been lines on maps transformed into scars across fields and railway embankments. The regiment moved eastward, chasing retreating units through villages that smelled of wet hay and diesel. Liberated towns waved flags hastily patched from sheets, and children who had not seen strangers in uniforms stared with unfiltered wonder. Paul, now more than a courier and less than a soldier, learned to read the subtle grammar of movement. Where men paused, there danger might be. Where women stared long, relief had been hard won.
The squad's new orders pushed toward a rail hub where German columns had once massed, and intelligence suggested caches of food and medical supplies might be found in hidden sidings. The men worked with the quiet efficiency of those who understand that patience can save lives. They scouted, they waited for night, and they used the cover of barns to move wounded to safety. Paul helped lift stretchers through dew-slick grass and learned to fit a bandage with hands that trembled but did not betray doubt. In the evening, a station master, hair powdered with flour from a half-baked loaf, pressed a coin into Paul's palm as thanks, a small, incongruous currency that made the boy feel for a moment like a grown man entrusted with the world's spare mercies. On September 17th, the Allied command launched Operation Market Garden, a bold airborne plan to seize bridges deep behind enemy lines. The papers, now scarcer and more precious, had diagrams with bold arrows and little crosshatches that meant risk. The regiment was tasked with support roles, securing drop zones, guiding convoys, and taking prisoners of war when opportunities arose. The air was taut with a different sort of tension. Paratroopers rehearsed exit drills, pilots checked compasses, and men sharpened words into curt orders. Paul watched from the edge of a field as planes shaped the sky into a lattice of white canopies. The sight made his throat close with an odd mixture of awe and foreknowledge of loss. When the first reports came in of fierce engagements at Arnhem and the bridge at Nijmegen, the camp filled with urgent radio strings and maps marked in red. Men moved with the quick, efficient care of those used to sudden shifts. Load the stretcher, secure the road, prepare for reinforcement. Paul felt the sharpness of history pressing against his ribs, an enormous physical shape that made small acts somehow more weighty. The aftermath of Market Garden brought a sober, heavy silence to units across the front. Arnhem's failure, a bridge held longer than hope had measured, left men heavy with questions and bodies with deeper lines of grief. Reinforcements shuffled through positions, and the regiment took in refugees whose stories were sharp and particular. A baker who had bartered his oven for shelter, women who had hidden children in cellars, a teacher who carried books as if they were talismans. Paul found himself cataloging these stories in his head, turning them into a ledger of human persistence. The corporal, now quieter than before, showed Paul a map annotated not only with military objectives but with notes, names of places to be checked for survivors, churches with intact roofs, wells with drinkable water. The boy came to understand that victory and failure were not always measured by flags, but by the lives that could be mended afterward. That evening, a small group gathered in a ruined courtyard to sing old songs, and the sound rose like a thin, resilient thread through broken stone. October introduced a cold that bit more than skin. It reached into morale and made decisions sharper. The regiment faced a corridor of operations that required choosing which villages to secure first and which roads risked ambush. Supply lines were stretched, and the quartermaster's lists grew thin. Paul, now fluent in the camp's quiet codes, helped sort winter blankets and stack firewood for civilians who had none. With winter approaching, officers debated whether to push forward or consolidate, and each choice smelled faintly of moral calculus, the lives saved here versus those risked elsewhere. The corporal asked Paul to carry a message to a neighboring command, a terse instruction about ration prioritization. Paul felt the odd elevation and horror of carrying words that could alter who ate and who did not. That night, he sat on a crate and wrote his own letter home, not to send, but to keep, telling of small mercies and the faces of those who had taught him how to be brave. The act of writing steadied him. Ink on paper was a small form of resistance to the war's chaos. November felt like a held breath. The front moved in long, slow inches, and soldiers learned to measure days by the frost on their blankets and the scarcity of fresh bread. Paul found himself given tasks that required patience rather than daring, reconnoitering squatted farmhouses for usable bedding, checking wells for contamination, and cataloging children's names scribbled on torn dolls. The camp grew a library of small rituals: coffee at a precise hour, letters read aloud, and a line of boots arranged by size and owner. One afternoon, an intelligence sergeant asked Paul to deliver a sealed pouch to a forward listening post. The walk took him across fields where hedgerows had been turned into teeth by shell fire. The silence was uncanny, as if the land were listening too. At the post, men hunched over rough radios, hoping to catch fragments of enemy chatter. Paul saw in the faces of those who worked the wires a weary concentration that turned language into a weapon. He learned that intelligence could be as decisive as ammunition. A fragment of a decoded message might reroute a convoy away from ambush or save a life. That evening, he pressed his palm to the tin memories of months past and let the wind carry away some small piece of fear. Late November brought news from far away. Ration shifts announced by crackling broadcasts, Allied advances measured in maps, and sometimes in the names etched on letters. Paul was allowed a rare leave to visit a village behind the lines where a makeshift market traded tobacco for canned peaches and children chased a patched football. He met a school teacher who taught him to balance sentences, not how to parse orders, but how to read aloud a poem and let the cadence steady a room. That evening, around a communal fire, an older soldier produced a small harmonica and played a tune that made men laugh and cry at the same time. In these pockets of ordinary life, Paul saw what the war aimed to protect: dinners not rationed into counts, laughter that belonged to no command, and the smell of bread unmeasured by scarcity. Yet the world remained thinly stitched. Letters home contained lists of lost friends, and the corporal's bandage had become stiffer, a reminder that even mercy came at a cost. Paul returned to camp with his pockets lighter, but his resolve firmer, carrying with him a poem copied into his notebook, and the sense that culture, songs, books, jokes, might be the skeleton keys that opened people back into life.
December 16 arrived with a ferocity that read like a betrayal. The Germans launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes. Dense forests became funnels of steel and snow, and the front snapped into chaos. Reports crackled through the regiment, columns moving like dark slugs, towns cut off, and supply lines imperiled. Paul experienced the offensive not as a headline, but as a rearrangement of the world beneath his feet. Convoys turned back, extra guards posted, and the cold sharpening into a new instrument of danger. The day the bulge hit their sector, the sky was a low, oppressive lid, and snow clung to uniforms like salt. Men who had weathered months of grinding attrition found their nerves frayed. Disciplined lines had to be rebuilt overnight.
Paul bolstered sandbags and ferried ammunition under a sky that seemed to press down with intent. In a narrow farmhouse, a radio operator decoded a message that rerouted reinforcements, a tiny victory within a large and furious setback. The bulge taught Paul a hard lesson. War's balance could tip suddenly, and adaptability, more than bravery, often kept people alive. By late January 1945, the Allies had restabilized lines, and eyes turned toward the Rhine, Europe's last great barrier before the German heartland. Preparations were clinical and relentless. Pontoon bridges readied, assault units fitted with waterproofing for engines, and commanders calculating river currents with the cold precision of tacksmen. The regiment's role was to secure crossing points and support engineers under fire. Paul, now nearly a man by experience, if not by years, helped test rope lines and delivered fuse detonators to engineers who worked with the stern faces of people accustomed to danger as a daily tool. Winter had thinned supply, but thickened resolve. Every man seemed to measure his steps against the knowledge that the end, however distant, was now visible on maps. That evening, as commanders argued about timing, Paul walked to the riverbank and watched ice move like a slow, powerful animal. He felt the weight of months in his hands, letters, a dented tin, and a ledger of names. And he understood the strange promise of rivers. They carry away what is lost, but also carry forward what remains.
The regiment had left the English hedgerows for the hard architecture of factory towns, sweeps of brick, silent rail yards and soot-black chimneys that marked the geography of industry. By late February, winter had thinned into something brittle. The men moved like careful ghosts through streets that remembered different languages. Paul's work had matured from small errands to serious courtesies. He carried packets of bandages, tins of tea, and knitted caps salvaged from supply bundles, and he learned how to present them so gratitude could survive the war's awkwardness. In a half-ruined schoolroom, he found a child's slate with letters slowly being rubbed away. He traced the strokes and felt a tug of the ordinary life these ruined rooms once held. An older woman with threadbare gloves pressed a crust of bread into his hands with a nod that contained more than thanks. It contained a pact to keep living. The regiment established small clinics and lists, names of the wounded, addresses for tracing families, the careful bureaucracy that makes survival legible. Paul copied details into the ledger with a trembling steadiness, learning that remembering names was itself a kind of rescue. At night, men traded stories of home and small plans for peacetime, a garden to tend, a shop to reopen, a child's first day at school. Those plans were fragile, like paper boats, but each one mattered. In this landscape of ruined brick and cautious hope, Paul began to understand the longer work of war, not only to push an enemy back, but to stitch a life forward for those who remained.
The Rhine presented itself as a slow, dark promise, and as a boundary that had to be crossed. On March 23, the regiment moved into a different register of operations. Engineers by floodlight assembling pontoons, assault boats tied and retied, rope lines tested against the river's stubborn current. The crossing was a technical and moral undertaking. It required calm calculation and the courage to move men into water that could carry an army away if anything failed. Paul watched from the bank as cables uncoiled and life jackets were adjusted. He had been given a small but solemn job, ferrying spare flares and a sealed satchel of detonators to a forward team. his hands steady, though the night bit hard. When the first boats pushed off, the water swallowed sound, and left only the soft slap of oars and the low murmur of men praying or reciting names. Under searchlights, shadows crossed the river like a new constellation of white canopies and helmets. The engineers fought the current and the cold, and medics stood ready to take the wounded in. At dawn, pontoon bridges creaked into place, and boots began to march across a structure that felt at once fragile and miraculous. Paul set his satchel down and watched the other bank fill with faces, civilians peering from windows, farmers stepping into the open air, and he felt the enormousness of a single crossing, that a river's passage could make a path into the heartland of a war, and perhaps toward an ending.
Spring light read like a statement on May 8th. V.E. Day's radio messages moved through the camp in the early morning. Official phrasing, clipped orders, then the loosening of a long, taut string. Town squares filled as if years of held breath had to be released in a single motion. Women collapsed into each other's arms, and children ran between rows of helmets, now exchanged for flower-strewn hands. The regiment stood in a square where laundry hung from balcony lines, and the baker gave away bread as if it were consecration. Paul carried his ledger, the dented tin, and a folded photograph of the little school slate. He walked the perimeter and listened as men read names from the ledger aloud, some soft, some laughing through tears. The corporal who had first given him a chocolate bar years earlier hugged him in the crush of strangers, and then stepped back to let civilians fill the space. People sang, some in broken tongues, some in old hymns. Church bells that had been silent now pealed with a new raw joy. For Paul the moment was not an end of memory, but an accrual of them. The ledger would remain, the tin kept as proof, and the faces of those lost would not be erased by victory. He understood then that peace would not arrive as a tidy thing. It would come as work, rebuilding windows, birthdays resumed, reconciliation spoken at kitchen tables. Yet that first day of peace tasted of sugar and smoke, and was, for many, the first breath taken without fear in years. This story began with a small boy stepping hesitantly into the orbit of men who carried entire strategies in their hands. It ends not with a single tidy moral, but with a ledger of names, a dented tin, and the slow accrual of memory. Proof that ordinary people, children and soldiers alike, do the unglamorous, necessary work of keeping life intact in the face of noise, fear, and sudden change. Paul's path from frightened 11-year-old to a quiet guardian of names is the documentary's measure of what war takes and what it leaves. Not only rubble and medals, but the small human contracts, a loaf shared, a name remembered, that restore what violence would erase. History records battles and dates. Intimate accounts, such as this one, try to keep the faces that history otherwise makes footnotes. If this documentary moved you, please subscribe, like, and share. It helps these stories find the people who need to remember.